2.6 Adaptations. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe how organisms adapt to the environment. And to accomplish this, we're going to start by explaining the connection between environmental changes and organism survival, and then explain the mechanisms of adaptation. So as we learned in the natural disruptions unit section, change is constant. We've seen that sea levels are changing. We've seen that in the past, temperature has changed, ocean and atmospheric circulations have changed, ice cover has changed. And in this example, a small change in sunshine triggered a chain of events that led to the whole world warming by about 3.5 degrees Celsius. And while this doesn't sound terribly hot or drastically different, small changes can have huge impacts on how organisms survive and adapt. Take the end Permian extinction, for example. Definitely not a small change, but the eruption of all these volcanoes completely changed the climate on Earth. What started as volcanic eruptions turned into ash clouds being spewed into the sky, which blocks the sun. There's no photosynthesis, it kills off plants. There was erosion, there was mudslides, the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were exceptionally high, the CO2 levels in the ocean were high, and as a result, 90% of life went extinct. So you can see in this graph of the end Permian extinction, the extinction rates were really high out here in the South Pole and the North Pole. But when we look at the tropics, we see that more species survived. And what allows these species to survive is their ability to adapt. The variation in their populations, which allowed them to adapt to the warming oceans, the warming air, and the loss of oxygen. So how do organisms survive? There has to be variation. And one of my favorite examples of adaptation is the kea, which is the only alpine and carnivorous parrot. And they have these adaptations which help them survive cold temperatures where they don't have access to the typical food that a parrot would eat. So original variation in their parrot population before Pangea broke up allowed these individuals to survive and reproduce because those were the ones that passed their genes on. So this brings me back to the rock pocket mice. We looked at these in the natural disruptions video. So if there is a population of mice where some of them are black and some of them are tan, how does this affect their survival and ability to pass their genes on? If the rocks in a new area are very dark, who's going to be eaten first? It's those tan mice. If you see the predator above, all those tan mice are very easy to spot if you're a predator. So the tan mice are eaten at a higher frequency than the black mice. The surviving mice are the ones to reproduce. So in this population, it's the black ones who survive to reproduce. And over time, the frequency of that tan color is going to go down because those ones will not make it to survive. Adaptation requires variation. So if there's no variation, there's no way for a population to adapt to changing temperatures, to changing landscapes, changing habitats, any outside pressure. So I don't want you to think that they can choose to adapt. My life would be a lot easier if I had a second set of arms, but I cannot choose or will myself to develop that adaptation. It has to already exist in the population before the pressure shows up. So if we have a group of butterflies that have different colors, they have variation. So the other key here is that the variation has to be heritable. If it can't pass from one generation to the other, it's not going to help them adapt to changing environments. So in addition to having a variation, there must be some sort of outside force that makes some variations suited better than others, or there's no need to adapt. So competition for resources. So limited resources, such as lack of habitat, lack of food, lack of mates, are going to make some of combinations of genes better than others. So this seems like it takes place on a long time scale, but this can actually happen very quickly depending on how quickly a species reproduces and how many offspring they have. So you're probably familiar with antibiotic resistance. So we start with your normal bacteria that get killed by the antibiotic plus one resistant bacteria. You start taking your antibiotics, it kills off all those bacteria, but it doesn't kill off the antibiotic resistance one, and eventually it just evolves into a resistant strain. So here's an animation showing bacteria adapting to differing levels of antibiotics. So out here on the edges, this is no antibiotics, and as we move in, you can kind of see there's these dividers. Those are different concentrations till we get to the center, which should be exceptionally toxic, but the bacteria mutates fast enough that it can continue to spread despite being treated with high levels of antibiotics that should kill it. So I've kind of alluded to this, but what causes the variation? We have mutations in the genes. So you should be familiar with this from biology. You could substitute one base for another, insert a couple of bases, delete a couple of bases, and this changes different phenotypes in the animals, in organisms. A great example of this is lactose persistence. So the default state for people is to not be able to digest lactose as an adult. This is something that infants should do that you grow out of as you get older because you're not consuming milk anymore. But they found in Europe that a single mutation of one base from a C to a T caused adults to be able to digest lactose into adulthood. And this led to as much as a 19% increase in the number of offspring they were able to have during the time when consuming dairy became more ingrained in different cultures. So you can see in this map the percentage of adults, the adults that can drink milk is kind of centered in these different clusters. And what they found is all of the mutations for lactose persistence developed individual of each other in these communities where relying on the ability to consume dairy was necessary for survival. So there was variation. Some people could digest it, some people could not. There was an outside pressure, the need to survive and have nutrition. And those that had the lactose persistence were able to digest the milk and therefore be stronger and healthier. And again, the ones that can reproduce are the ones who survive and pass on their genes. So how does this lead to new species? So we talked about variation, but it can also lead to new species. So I'm going to go back to my favorite fish, the cichlids. So at a certain depth, we have this group of cichlids, some are blue and some are red. And over here, at this depth sensitivity, you can see blue light and blue coloration is favored. But as you go a little bit deeper, the red light sensitivity and red coloration is favored. So what will this do to populations over time? After many generations, the two parts of these population will be individual and separate. So the blue ones will breed with the blue ones, the red ones will breed with the red ones, because any red males that may wander up to where the blues are will not have any success. Over time, they'll be completely different species because they'll no longer be able to breed together and produce fertile offspring. So this is a behavioral adaptation. So this change in their behaviors cause them to become different species. It can also happen due to geography. So this goes back to that parrot I talked about. They were once together, now they're apart, evolved into a totally different species. These two different porkfish were originally part of the same species, but due to the Panama Isthmus showing up, they can no longer breed, became completely independent species. So to summarize, our goal was to describe how organisms adapt to their environment, and we learned today that heritable variation in a population is necessary to adapt to an ever-changing world, and variation is the result of small changes, called mutations, in the genes. A new species can arise from geographic isolation, so they're physically separated, or through behavioral isolation, so they have changes that prevent the organisms, even in the same area, from producing viable offspring over time.